Afternoon. This is a meeting of the Great Lakes Advisory Board. I am Todd Nedesheim, the acting DFO for this Federal Advisory Committee. We are here today to hear the Great Lakes Advisory Board will present and discuss their final recommendations to the charge questions that EPA provided about a year ago. I'm very looking forward to hearing those recommendations and the discussion that will occur with that. I just have one housekeeping issue. If there's anyone, members of the public, that would like to make a statement towards the end of this meeting, please reply to Curd. He had provided you the YouTube link that has the live streaming of this meeting, and he will communicate that information to our co-chairs, Steve Galarno and Kyle Dreyfus-Wells. And then before we turn it over to our co-chairs, I would like to introduce Chris Korleski, the director of EPA's Great Lakes National Program Office, and he will provide a few opening remarks. So take it away, Chris.
Thanks, Todd. Good afternoon, everyone. Certainly, I really want to say welcome to the GLAB. I'm looking forward to the discussion and the report out today. One of the things I just want to make very clear is at EPA, we understand how much work has gone into the preparation of the materials that we're going to talk about today. And we can't thank you enough. We understand that you're doing this on your own time and on your own dime, and you're doing it because you have a passion for the Great Lakes and these critical issues that we are facing today, none of which are easy, or none of which come up with a ready-made solution. So on behalf of EPA, I just want to thank all the members of the GLAB for the difficult, challenging, time-consuming work. And I want to tell you, we really look forward to hearing about the report out. And you certainly have my word that we will give the report, the work that you've done, the recommendations that you've adopted, great consideration as we go forward, which is the entire purpose of having this wonderful advisory body, to get the input and advice from someone other than EPA, which I think is critical, and to get us out of our bubble, if you will. So again, I just want to welcome everyone to the call. I want to, again, express my thanks to all the members of the GLAB. And in particular, please let me express my thanks to Steve and Kyle for an outstanding job chairing the GLAB over the last 2 years. So my personal thanks to you again. And with that, Kyle and Steve, I will get out of your way and turn it over to you. And I'm looking forward to a good call. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Todd. Frank, do you have the PowerPoint that Steve shared? Perfect. Great. So as Chris and Todd said, this is our hopefully final Great Lakes Advisory Board meeting on these particular charge questions. And so I'll just sort of set the stage, which was also set in Lindsay's email that she provided to everyone. And Lindsay has just joined us as well. So we have, through the great work that everyone has done, and also the great support from Curd and Chris to put this together, we have the Great Lakes Advisory Board's final report to EPA. And again, very much appreciate all the work. So our purpose here today is to have members of the GLAB, essentially, as Steve put it, provide this sort of flyover overview of those recommendations to the federal partners that are on the call, and to take any questions and provide any further explanation. We thought that that was a really helpful way, with us all so busy, to just have a conversation about those recommendations and answer any questions. And then at the end of the meeting, we would like to have a vote to finalize these recommendations and formally submit those to EPA. So that is what we'd like to accomplish today. Steve, I'll turn it over to you to take us further.
Thank you, Kyle, and thank you, Todd and Chris, of course, for the getting us started. Could you advance us to slide 3, please? Yes, that one. So, sorry, of course, my cell phone had to ring at that moment. Really appreciate this opportunity to kind of give you that overview, if you will. But it's a lighter touch, and I sincerely hope that that folks have had a chance to dive into the report. And I know that others, share the interest. If you see things that you want to follow up with us when you want some more time, we'd very much welcome that. You can see on this slide the members, and of course, they're identified in the report. If I could have the next slide, please. So as we indicated, with the amount of time we have this afternoon and the amount of material and hard work that this board has put in, we're just going to touch on some topics. The idea is to stimulate the conversation and hear some of the feedback, initial thoughts by EPA and others. And then we, of course, welcome a deeper dive on it. If I could have the next slide, please. And I'd like to send it over to you, Scudder, if you could present a bit of this on behalf of us, please, for nutrients.
Okay, very good. Let's go to the next slide, please. Well, first of all, welcome from the Nutrient Work Group. I'm going to be talking about two specific themes that we were charged to address. One is dealing with legacy phosphorus, which is the phosphorus that is basically incorporated into the sediments and or the waters of the Great Lakes. It is bound and is part of the sort of residual phosphorus that remains in the system, but does enter into our Great Lakes. And then I'll be talking about a second theme, which is focused on excess phosphorus, which is basically the phosphorus that is applied generally on an annual basis to the landscape. Both combined together to create the total phosphorus load. So with respect to theme one, which is focused on legacy phosphorus, we have a number of bullet points here. These are high-level bullet points. They by no means represent the total number of recommendations. I believe we had 9 recommendations total. And what I wanted to do is just sort of, as Steve had mentioned, just touch on these briefly. Let's just get going here. Basically, these recommendations are designed to allow US EPA to more effectively allocate GLRI funding and resources that will maximize phosphorus reductions within the Great Lakes. And I do want to make a note here that some of the recommendations that you will see here for theme 1 and theme 2 are duplicative, as these specific recommendations apply both to legacy phosphorus and also to excess phosphorus. So, for example, if we look at the first 2 bullet points, they're focused on identifying critical source areas and implementation of long-term watershed monitoring programs, and they both apply to themes 1 and 2. And long-term monitoring is necessary. The nutrient team believes that long-term monitoring is necessary to assess the spatial and temporal distribution of source areas and how those source areas may change through time. Moreover, long-term monitoring allows us to set targets, measure progress in achieving those targets, assessing the long-term performance and maintenance of various conservation management and nutrient reduction practices, and also allows us to identify potential opportunities for future investment, particularly GLRI investments, to further reduce and maximize nutrient reductions in the Great Lakes. And of note, the identification of critical source areas and long-term monitoring strategies. We have to have a better understanding of the relative contributions of legacy phosphorus and excess or applied phosphorus, and how they basically integrate together to yield the total phosphorus loads that enter into the lakes. And this is highlighted in the 3rd bullet. And for example, some of the preliminary results as we were working through this particular set of issues, if we focus on legacy phosphorus. Some of the results suggest that up to 80% of the total P load is legacy phosphorus, with only 20% attributable to excess or applied phosphorus. So if we focus almost exclusively on excess phosphorus, that is the phosphorus that's applied on an annual basis, we're only addressing maybe 20 to 30% of the problem. Now, what this suggests that maybe we need to focus more on measures that address transport pathways, and basically that is how does legacy phosphorus and nutrients move through the system across the landscape and down through the tributaries into the lakes. But these are really may not be correct. There's a considerable more research that needs to be done, but it does highlight the importance of focusing a bit more on the distinctions between legacy phosphorus and applied or excess phosphorus. I think the other point here is that we need to focus on innovative long-term funding strategies and to fund additional technical assistance and grant management programs to local communities, but also to fund long-term monitoring and maintenance needs related to many of the GLRI projects that have been funded. This also allows the agencies and communities, and I'm going to use a special term here, to get off the grant gravy train and also build the capacity of underserved local communities to obtain the resources necessary to address local and regional water quality improvement and nutrient reduction needs. This includes GLRI-funded public-private partnerships, pay-for-performance conservation programs, and the creation of regional endowment funds, which we describe in more detail in the full report. Next slide, please. This second theme is focused on excess or applied phosphorus. And as I said before, this is phosphorus that is applied directly to the landscape and or to the agricultural fields. And similar to the discussions or the recommendations that we had for theme one, we are again focused on identifying critical source areas and identifying those watersheds that contribute excess phosphorus loads, specifically during the March to July timeframe, which has been shown to be a critical time period. That's where the bulk of the loading occurs that drives the harmful algal blooms that we see in the western basin of Lake Erie. And this also requires additional long-term monitoring as well. The second bullet is focused on the need for additional research and funding for innovative technologies and or engineered nutrient removal systems, along with the long-term monitoring needed to assess the performance and the effectiveness of those technologies. And for example, in Ohio, through our H2 Ohio program, we're making substantial investments in natural infrastructure, primarily coastal wetlands and wetlands up in the watersheds. And these investments are designed to trap, sequester, and process nutrients and sediment. And hopefully they'll be very effective in terms of removing excess nutrients. However, during the March to May time periods, wetlands, in this case, early in the season, let's say from March until May, the plants are just starting to germinate. We don't have much in the way of aquatic vegetation available to help process the nutrients. And so we sort of miss out in the early parts of the nutrient loading season in terms of having substantial nutrient reduction benefits. So this seasonal gap can probably be addressed if we implement a hybrid gray-green approach where we're looking at certain types of combined engineered approaches with natural infrastructure approaches, where earlier in the season, these engineered approaches can start to address the nutrient reduction needs that we need to see. And then later in the season, the wetlands or the natural infrastructure can basically take over and process and manage the nutrients naturally. The other thing about the engineered solutions is that many of our wetlands and many of the best management practices that we implement on the landscape do not function well during peak discharge events. They are in essence overwhelmed. And at least in many of the basins, the nutrient loads occur primarily during these peak discharge events. So any sort of research or projects that we can design that would help us remove some of that excess load during peak discharge events would be of I think, a significant benefit, particularly in Lake Erie and in the Maumee watershed area. And finally, the last two bullets are focused on a much broader landscape approach to nutrient reduction. And really what we're talking about here is that we may be able to develop a number of land use planning models and or develop more robust tools, including SWOT models. I know we've done a lot of SWOT modeling, but I think we could do a better job at calibration and implement these tools at regional scales that allows us to, number one, systematically identify and confirm critical source areas, and this is for excess nutrients, but also look at broader scale regional land use plans that are specifically designed to identify and locate, let's say, a portfolio of nutrient management reduction projects that actually work together to maximize nutrient reduction benefits. We've been doing some of this using landscape conservation design principles for ecosystem functions. I don't think that it's necessarily been done for water quality benefit or for nutrient reduction purposes yet. And in essence, I'm going to use another unique term. I typically use the term random acts of conservation or random acts of restoration. I'm going to call this random acts of nutrient reduction, where we've made substantial investments across the landscape. But it is rare that I see that these investments are designed to work together, where water moves from one nutrient reduction project to the next systematically to maximize the potential nutrient reduction benefits. So I think this broader scale sort of regional planning and approach may enable us to do a better job at citing, but also investing in those projects that are designed to work together in order to maximize those nutrient reduction benefits. So I think that's pretty much where I wanted to go with this. I just touched base on a couple of the topics or the bullets or the recommendations that we've made. They're a little bit different than perhaps the more detailed recommendations, some of which are in our report. We did do a substantive review of many of the implementation practices and conservation and management practices. But what we decided to show here are sort of the broader scale, higher level ways that we can actually integrate those practices together and maybe make them much more effective as an integrated portfolio of projects rather than a set of sort of random projects that do function and do make a difference, but I think we could do it much better. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Scudder. And I like to think of it as you were just served the appetizer. The rest of the meal's in the report. So I would invite you to take a look at that. If we could have the next slide, please. Before I hand it over to Lisa, I would like to encourage people to put questions into the chat box. If ideas or questions, comments come to mind, please do that, and then we can circle back to those when we get to the discussion. So Lisa, if you could provide us with an overview of the aquatic invasive species recommendations, please.
Thank you, Steve. Next slide, please. Scudder, thank you. That was nicely done. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be quite as detailed as you are on what we're talking about here, but our theme was invasive species. And once our team started talking, we wanted to focus on aquatic invasive species. Not saying that one was more important than the other, but that's just kind of where the conversation of our team went. We looked at pathways instead of species specific, mainly because we, in our conversations, believe that by focusing on pathways, we could possibly find solutions for more than one species by doing so. So that's kind of where our introduction went with the report. We ended up having 12 recommendations complete. while I am sure there are other recommendations that can be added to the report, we thought these 12 were in the top to put in the report. The first one we talked about was improving coordination, information exchange, and database sharing at federal, state, and local levels. There are many state, local, governmental advocacy groups working on the problem of invasive species, especially aquatic invasive species. And our committee believed that by sharing information across the board would be best use of resources to see what others were doing, so we don't have too much of a repetitive issue on controlling invasive species. One example would be the Asian carp, the invasive carp that had come up from the Chicago water area waterways into potential havoc into the Great Lakes. Another one that was discussed was the zebra mussels, looking at how several agencies are working on this, how we could coordinate as teams to address the issues. We also talked about continually investing in new technologies, and the word continually is pretty important in this conversation. You know, sometimes EPA finds a fix that they like, and we don't continue investing in what's new and what can be used. So we as a committee believed that by continually looking and continually testing out new technologies, we would best stumble upon an adequate technology to address certain invasive species, potentially maybe one species that we could control. This technology might be used for another species in another pathway. So the continual investment, continual research, we felt as a team was very, very important. And the third one I just kind of wanted to address was the coordinating with the International Joint Commission in the development and implementation of an early warning system in the Great Lakes, and initiating a coordinated research and stakeholder engagement program. You know, the best defense is a good offense, let's be honest. If we could prevent the species from entering the Great Lakes, that would be ideal. Unfortunately, that doesn't always work. So if we are able to have an early warning system when we first see an invasive species enter, that we have a game plan to hit the ground running, to hopefully minimize the impacts and eliminate that impact of that species brings to the Great Lakes. As Scudder said, you know, we want you to read the report. We've spent some good hard hours on the report. I personally think my team did a great job. I'm biased, I'm the chairperson, but yeah, we'd like you to take a look and give us some feedback. Steve?
Very nice overview, Lisa. Thank you very much. Yeah, we're going to say it again and again. You're just getting a little glimpse at it. So we're, I know that a number of the people on the EPA team have read the full report, and those who have not had a chance to, we certainly encourage them to do that. A lot of hard work was put in by this team. So if I could have the next slide, please. And Kyle, I think I'll hand it over to you, please.
Great, thanks, Steve. Thanks, Lisa and Scudder. And I will just emphasize the report reads like a novel, so like a really good novel. So I encourage everybody to dive into that. So much great work has gone into this. All right, so now we're going to move, if you're following along with your charge questions, we're going to move to themes 3, 5, and 6, which all center around the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, with a series of questions that came from the agency around Great Lakes Restoration Initiative outreach, how to best invest the dollars, and then really this focus on vitality and reinvestment. And I'll turn it over to Sylvia to take us through this conversation.
Thank you very much for that introduction there, Kyle. And so I want to start off with also acknowledging the other members of this work group, because we did a lot in a short amount of time, and some might say we were quite ambitious, but I think that we also were feeling very motivated for some additional questions that we had in the conversations of the charge. So I want to begin with acknowledging Chairman Jim Williams, who I understand is not here with us today. I'm not sure if Frank Edwagishik has been able to join us yet, but we've also been delighted to have Laura Rubin and her work, especially with the Healing Our Waters Great Lakes initiative, has also been really helpful for some of the work that we developed into the 3 themes that we worked on. I want to also just really appreciate the space and time that this advisory board also offered us in our work group to be able to not only sort of expand the scope and kind of change our interpretation of some of the charge questions, which led us to be able to really add additional recommendations that weren't probably going to be incorporated had we not sort of sought that willingness from the rest of the board to do so. And I think in many ways helped us really provide for a stronger charge, especially in the current administration, where there is a lot of conversation around what it means to do work that acknowledges climate change, the need for climate justice, and particularly environmental justice. And so those are also within the context of what the administration is also having us look at by way of the implementation of Justice 40, which again would be looking at how it is that all of the resources from the federal government, or at least 40% of those resources, I should say, can be used in order to have benefits that impact environmental justice communities, right? Using the federal resources in ways that make a difference, a measurable difference. And so going on to theme 3 there, I want to just sort of kind of set the stage for how it is we approach these. So we wanted to make sure that among all things, we really were looking at how is it that the GRLI has been successful and how it approached the kinds of ways in which it's engaging with communities, how it's measuring, what those reporting mechanisms have been, and how it is we can access and even maybe interpret those reports. And admittedly, we struggled to be able to get some of the information. And so one of the things that we said front and center is we really have to look at how we're developing and implementing those community engagement metrics and where the data is being accumulated and how it's being interpreted, analyzed, and used so that we can better understand what that engagement looks like, what the communication is doing. And so we also wanted to make sure that there were these frameworks that were getting established for how that engagement is happening, particularly when we're talking about working with community organizations or other local-based spaces and groups, which could be non-traditional stakeholders, or even spaces like libraries, where people will gather to have communications about where they're impacted, or in other kinds of spaces for engagement about problems in need of solution. So we also wanted to bring some attention in the report to what it is that the EPA is doing in terms of prioritizing the reporting of the impacts of GRLI programs on environmental justice and climate change. And again, really wanting to see how it is that there can be better processes for ensuring that underserved communities, especially in AOCs, are included in that meaningful engagement that matters, especially when we're talking about how EPA not only defines, but stipulates that this is something that must be done, especially in this administration right now. We've heard repeatedly, at least in, for example, the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, the administrator saying repeatedly that he was working on ensuring that environmental justice is included across all EPA programs. So we wanted to make sure that that was getting incorporated into the charge and the conversations that we're having here. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. So in theme 5, this is again another area where we really wanted to talk about what are those outcome-based investments. And among the recommendations we have there again is looking at what are those broad sets of project outcomes that are currently being done, but may not be including components like environmental justice or climate change, climate justice, or public health impacts. And so we know that there are different ways that people who are participating in these projects and programs are measuring or reporting on such, but we want to see it done with more intentionality, more deliberateness, so that we can actually say, look, here are the ways in which the GRLI is measuring, capturing, reporting on how communities are being impacted, but also how they're participating in these projects so that the outcomes can be successful in areas where people are disproportionately impacted. We also talked about establishing procedures to ensure that there's the enabling of consideration for funding projects that require resources for long-term operation and maintenance. And so kind of going back a little bit to what Scudder was describing about gravy train. You know, I think we're talking about a flip side of that. We've got a lot of communities that have never been on the train, never even seen the train. And so we're wanting to make sure, again, that we're building in more equitable ways and processes so that communities can participate, and that where there haven't been funding initiatives, that there are ways in which we're building processes so that more people, communities can participate, and then bring in the researchers that again can help them with getting resolved to questions and concerns that they have. Another one of the components there was about implementing a framework with specific EJ outcomes, again, to support cohesive Great Lakes programs that recognize and appropriately incorporate the priorities of tribes and traditional ecological TEK knowledge. And one of the things that, again, was pretty meaningful for us when we were looking more closely at these issues is we were very fortunate to have true tribal members in our work group who, again, told us not only of like the data and the reports that they study and they participate in, but the stories behind them and how tribal communities and tribal nations and indigenous communities are really being impacted by climate change in the Great Lakes, and how this is a particularly concerning and dangerous time for people that are tied to the land, whose cultures and ways of life are very much intrinsic to the ways of life of how they live and what they're wanting to also be responsible for in relationship with the earth. And so we took that really to heart in trying to figure out how is it that we not only translate, but really incorporate what it is that TEK is doing by way of how they approach the issues, but the things that we need to be thinking about in terms of how they're addressing problems themselves. And so we know that also like tribal colleges are another incredible source of information and training for communities. And we know that EPA has a lot of programs itself that they do in connection with tribes. But with the GLRI in particular, we're wanting to see that there's, again, more incorporation of how it is that the tribes are taking their knowledge and data and using that for the successful positive outcomes that we need in this initiative. I think, but let's go on to the next slide, please. So on the last three themes that we focused on, this is the one where we wanted to actually do a little bit more of a twist on it and focus more like on the climate change aspects here. And so you'll see that the first recommendation that we have is one that has examples that include the supporting of those assessments of climate change in this Great Lakes Basin, and particularly how they're affecting the environmental and public health of communities, and what are those economic metrics that we're also looking at. We know that a lot of communities are struggling with drought and floods, and they're having to figure out how to be more resilient and sustain not only their infrastructure, but their economies and local ways of life. And so research that is ongoing or other kinds of development that's taking place, it would be helpful to have sort of earlier understandings working with those communities of how there can be more mitigation on the climate change impacts, because we know that this is something that's going to be an increasing problem and will require more efforts towards the restoration of impacts as they're happening and growing. We also know that there's an interest in having more early development of what the GLRI Action Plan 4 will be. And so we're hoping that part of what is also contributed by this board into this report will be something that can be incorporated in that next plan as it's getting thought about. We also want to ensure really that the action plans are including environmental justice and climate change, and that they're not an afterthought. This has been one of the struggles, I think, that even some of the founding members or people that have been part of like the history of the GLRI have said for many years that environmental justice was a conversation early on, but it never really got incorporated. And as we experience climate change here in the Great Lakes, it really needs to be something that is front and center along with the other more science-based items that were in the earlier part of the report. And then lastly, we wanted to make sure that, again, with this current administration, that we really are doing an intentional focus around Justice 40 and how to use the funding of the GLRI and other infrastructure funds and other kinds of federal initiatives that have come through to the states and into the regions to ensure that the initiatives are also looking at what ways that impacted communities can benefit both in the improvement of the health, public health metrics and environmental cleanup needs that they have, but also improving the quality of life for residents. Way of like another example, we really spoke a lot about the changes to what is happening with wild rice in tribal communities or manumin, and how it is that this is another example of what it means when if we don't pay attention to things that we might overlook as we're looking at other sorts of contaminants and problems, that we don't see like how we've got systems that are very vulnerable that we need to pay attention to sooner than later. So I think that was kind of a wrap of where we went. And then also express our appreciation to Chris Bush, who helped us with copy editing and spent a lot of extra time with our work group in trying to get our parts of the report completed. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sylvia. As Frank put in the chat, if anyone is not muted, please mute. So Steve, did you want to add anything to Sylvia's comments?
I guess I'd mostly want to say excellent job, Sylvia. Thank you very, very much for that. I would like to add that because this was 3 themes and a pretty heavy lift, we had the Val, John, and Kay also helped weigh in with some of these. And again, this is an appetizer, folks. There's a lot here. And as Sylvia pointed, there's a lot of hard work embedded in these recommendations. And it's so terribly important. So thank you, Sylvia, for that excellent overview.
Okay, excellent. So we've heard from our 3 work group leads, Scudder, Lisa, and Sylvia, working together with Steve for that big GLRI work group, which was split into 2 work groups. And so now I'll just speak on behalf of the GLAB. We would really welcome any questions from EPA or any members of the federal family. That would be a great opportunity for us. If there's any questions at all that have come up, you can just raise your hand. And I think actually, Frank, it would be helpful if we could just take down the PowerPoint and then we can all see each other and then I can see hands. So anyone at all, there's no stupid questions. Like there's, questions that aren't great, but there's no stupid, I'm just kidding. There's no stupid questions. So anything at all that that you want to ask the members of the GLAB about, that would be just terrific.
And
So,
go ahead, Chris.
yeah, a couple of questions here, a lot of food for thought. So I'll go ahead and dive in.
Great.
First, Scudder, can you elaborate a little bit on your comment about the gravy train? I want to make sure I understand exactly what you mean by that. And I'm not taking it, don't get me wrong, I'm not offended by that. I want to know, what exactly did you mean? What are we talking about there?
Yeah, Chris, I'll be happy to respond to that. And that's not something that's necessarily that's more me than the work group. But what I'm referring to is the continual reliance on grant funding in order to implement many of these projects and these programs. Okay, and I'm referring to it as a gravy train because because those grant sources are there from multiple places. We get used to filling out the applications and getting the funding, and we just keep going. But it doesn't necessarily provide the incentive to think about alternative funding mechanisms, and particularly long-term funding mechanisms. And of concern, and this it was mentioned briefly, is that I mean, when you look at certain types of projects, they require long-term monitoring and maintenance to make sure that they're performing. And the problem is that federal, state, local governments in many cases are limited by their budget cycles in terms of how long they can commit resources. And they don't know 2 years or 1 year or 2 years down the road whether those funds will actually exist. So we have to find alternative funding mechanisms that provide long-term fund, a stable long-term funding continuity in order to do the types of make the long-term investments in the monitoring and the maintenance work, but perhaps also in some of the, the broader assessments that we do regionally. Rather than relying on 1 or 2 years, the grant's done, the project teams disappear, you lose a lot of that expertise, and then all of a sudden you start reinventing the wheel. So hopefully that clarifies that. And I didn't mean gravy train necessarily in a derogative sense, but if you're a dog and you have a bowl of dog food, you keep coming back to that bowl for a snack. Okay.
Understood.
Okay.
So I had another question as well. So that's very helpful. You talked about a combination of both, I think you called it natural infrastructure and then gray infrastructure. Can you give me an example of the kind of gray infrastructure projects that you're thinking about?
Sure. I actually sort of inserted more of a coastal term there because, I do a lot of work along the coast. But what we're talking about are basically engineered solutions where, if you're doing natural infrastructure, you're talking about maybe wetland designs or other types of ponds or pools or things of this sort that have, a broad range of environmental benefits. But I think that we're also talking about maybe certain types of filtration systems, engineered filtration systems or treatment systems, where you could bind these together to work either independently or in parallel, depending on the conditions that you're experiencing. Okay. And that's what I mean by gray-green infrastructure. And specifically, what I was trying to highlight is that with wetlands in particular, in the early parts of the nutrient loading season, they're not all that effective. You don't have the plants in place. A lot of the benefits of slowing the water and processing the nutrients aren't there because the plants are barely emerging out of the the pond bed or the wetland bed. And so during that time period, which could be critical, maybe there could be some alternative treatment systems in place that could actually manage that until the wetlands become more, let's say, mature.
Okay. So Scudder, knowing you and you're a candid guy, which we very much appreciate. And if our discussions weren't candid, this process would not be as valuable as it could be. So I'm gonna ask you if the proverbial elevator speech. If we had 30 seconds together riding up in an elevator from floor 1 to floor 19, and I said, Scudder, I only got 10 seconds. Tell me what you think we're really doing right, but I also need to know what you think we're doing wrong. What would you tell me? And again, we need to have candid conversations because we want to make our program better.
Boy, I think you just rolled a grenade on the table and pulled the pin. So that's it.
I think he'd hit the stop button on the elevator.
Right, I did. Yeah. I do think that many of the investments that GLRI have made have been good investments. In many cases, they're focused in the right place. What I don't see is the long-term monitoring and assessment component to determine whether or not those projects are actually functioning as designed. You may monitor them and assess them during a short period of time, and they're really great. You take credit for that, and then you walk. Okay. And I think that that's something that it could be addressed with this long-term funding, long-term maintenance and monitoring component, which I think is. And then the second thing tied to that is, as I mentioned in a bit in my presentation, is the need to actually link the projects together in a way that one feeds water to the next, so you have the cumulative benefits, not a set of random projects where they're not connected or they're not designed to function together. I think you could certainly improve that as well. Okay.
So let me, I just want to echo what Kyle put up in the chat, which is that same question is open game to anyone on the board. I would love to hear what people think because we need to have that very candid conversation. Scudder, I'll respond briefly. One of the issues that we have been struggling with since the inception of the GLRI is where do we draw the line between continually moving on to other critical, important projects that clearly need to be done in areas that clearly need attention versus husbanding resources to use them for long-term maintenance, long-term assessment forever. And it is a sticky issue because every dollar you put aside to say we're going to use it here to maintain this project is a dollar not being used to clean up the next AOC or to be devoted to the next watershed where you've got significant nutrient problems, et cetera. But it is something we're very aware of, and to this point have not come to a clear conclusion on where that line should be. But your comments are extremely helpful. I don't want to take Todd. I think I interrupted you, so I'll stand down for a moment. I've got many more questions, but Todd, take it away.
Well, and I also think Chris John Hull raised his actual hand.
Okay.
So I think he's serious. Go ahead, John.
He did. Thanks. Just to build on Scudder's a little bit, and my interpretation of the gray, more engineered applications to accompany the green is passive versus active, and a green solution or green component of a watershed treatment system is something that you don't have to do much to after you put it into place. But a gray component may require periodic maintenance. It's very much akin to a forebay on a lake where you're accumulating sediment. Best management practices under stormwater, where you've got to do something on a regular basis or the system ceases to function. And that gets back to your question about, okay, but how do we fund these things? And it's a big problem because quite often on a dollar per pound basis, long-term, the active system is going to be more efficient than the passive system. Yeah, and we all love, one final comment, we all love to come to, what ribbon cutting ceremonies when somebody spent a bunch of millions of dollars to build a new wastewater treatment plant or something, state-of-the-art thing. Nobody comes every week and brings the operators, coffee and donuts and says, thanks, good job, or even gives them a pay raise when appropriate. So this maintenance and long-term funding is a big riddle to this.
I'm sorry, Chris. Oh, go ahead, Kyle.
No, go ahead. I was just, Kay, jump in after Chris's reply. Go ahead though, Chris, sorry.
I was just going to say, maybe we need to think about a coffee and donut fund. So I was being facetious, but let's hear from Kay.
Thanks. I was going to go back to your question, Chris, on the good and the bad situation. And I think throughout this process and our various meetings that this group have had, I've become more aware of this siloed approach being prevalent in each of the themes. And that's good because you've got the experts looking at that and you have the agency experts looking at that. But it's bad from the standpoint of coming to solutions for the individual silos. And so I'm really excited about the fact that I think when folks read the full document that they will see that there are a lot of crossover comments and recommendations made amongst the various themes that will let the readers know we are looking at making recommendations to improve upon the overarching approach to the issues and what a solution here does to an issue, a problem here. And, much like Scudder was mentioning, great, you do a nutrient project here, but downstream or upstream, you haven't. So what have you really accomplished? And I say that at the danger of, perhaps finding a pet project of mine not getting funded because in the big picture, it doesn't have, it doesn't reach out and touch other projects. And as such, I can't be critical if you're not successful in that as an agency. That's a heavy prioritization lift. Thank you.
Thanks, Kay. Let me just ask the group. So I want to think about just for a moment this long-term maintenance and funding issue. Is the group advocating, for example, that we create that somewhere, somehow there's a separate fund set up, either with GLRI funding or other funds that we do sort of keep in a separate pot for doing nothing but maintaining and monitoring GLRI projects. And I say that not because I know that that would be easy to do and we have expiring money and we have all those logistical issues, but assuming we did not, would that be a recommendation? I mean, is that something you would say, yeah, you ought to consider that, have seed money or have a maintenance fund set aside so you've always got money in the pot to monitor and or fix projects that you've constructed.
Alan, I know you have another comment, but I'm sure you have a comment on that as well. So do you just want to just jump in and start that?
Sure. Can I talk about the former comment first before I talk about the second? Thank you. So the first one's going to be a little more provocative. The second one will be a little easier. When we talk about the solutions for the Great Lakes, I mean, the reality is, Chris, that 50 years on, we're still dealing with the same issues that we had back then, maybe in different forms, but we haven't resolved the problems facing the Great Lakes when it comes to nutrients. So, as unappetizing as this is, I think we need to start thinking about regulation and enforcement of regulation. Nobody wants that to begin with, but TMDLs and voluntary performances just aren't getting the job done in parts of the Great Lakes. So I think this needs to be considered before we start dealing with litigation, because that's going to be the alternative. And having come from the Everglades, let me tell you, litigation is not the way to go. It gets very, very, adversarial and to the point of death threats. So that's not the route. So I'm going to move on to something a little more, perhaps a little more acceptable. We started a endowment fund here at the Community Foundation for Muskegon County 20 years ago to monitor Muskegon Lake as an AOC, to give EPA the data that they needed to show that, whether are we meeting our restoration targets. That was done with private investments from the community, recognizing that the restoration of this lake is essential for the revitalization of this community. So when Scudder talks about these public-private partnerships, that's exactly the kinds of approaches that I would recommend. It's worked really well here. Not every community will have the same resources. Some communities will have a lot more resources than Muskegon. But to me, working with your community foundation or some other trust, it could be in a bank, building an endowment fund, that is the way that it just continues to pay in perpetuity with the interest earnings from that. And it doesn't fund all of our monitoring costs, but then we can leverage those dollars when we write proposals to get more dollars. So to me, that is a really obvious, relatively easy to implement solution. If it wants to be seed funded by GLRI, all the better, because that might get more people involved, but it can happen certainly without EPA investment as well. So,
Alan, thank you. And I just want to clarify one question. When you were talking about, maybe it's time for regulation, I assume you're talking about regulation of non-point sources in some fashion, but I want to make sure that that's clear.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Go ahead, Sylvia.
Thanks very much for all of the great comments so far by board members. And Chris, I really appreciate too the way that you sort of set up the conversation to do it in an honest way, because I think what I want to offer is also by way of trying to get the honesty that I think we need in terms of why maybe you're grappling with how to approach where to direct monies or where to hold on to monies. And part of this is I think a lack of just sort of forthright accountability for about polluters, right? And the sources where we keep having to address the same kinds of pollution or locations of pollution, and trying to really figure out how we can put more actionable efforts toward stopping what is happening in certain sectors of the economy that contribute to the sources that we have to address later on. And so in part of that, we had some conversation with GLAB members, was also about where new development is taking place. And again, when we're talking in the context of even environmental justice communities, that where cleanups happen or areas of concern have been addressed, then we've got the gentrification problems and people that get dislocated and the cost of living goes up and people again are moved out of what could have been the benefits to them and sort of having to live with or suffering through the environmental experiences. But there's got to be ways in which the conversations in the communities where polluters exist or where they have left re-engages those industries, those sectors, in terms of like how it is that they no longer are participating in those factors or forces, but that they're also being held responsible in some way, so that we don't talk about these situations as if they just sort of happened out of nowhere, right? And like, how did we get here? And instead, we're really looking at how to hold some greater level of accountability for communities that continue to have to keep dealing with it when if it's not one group, it's the next one who's around the corner. But there needs to be a level, I think, of honesty even in that willingness to have that engagement.
Sylvia and Kyle, with your permission, I'd like to just follow up with a sort of a further discussion. So Sylvia, thank you. And I want to go back to one, you raised some great issues, but I want to go back to one in particular. And, the issue of, okay, so you've cleaned something up, but what about the gentrification issue? So let me be devil's advocate for just a minute. So, at EPA, certainly in areas of concern, for example, we're trying to deal with that legacy contamination that's been there for, in some cases, over 100 years. It's just been there for a really long time. And our goal, I think that one of my primary goals is to try to get that sediment cleaned up, which is why we're focusing so hard on AOCs. But let's assume that we do a really good job working with our many partners and we take a degraded, somewhat abandoned, an area where you've got people without income, people of color, people without good education, whatever the situation may be. But certainly we would view it as an area that's underserved and overexposed to environmental damage historically. We clean that up. In your view, does EPA have a role in figuring out how that area is now developed, or is that more of a local issue best left to the local community, simply because, certainly I don't know anything about gentrification or development, or very little in general. So how do you think EPA can play a role there, given that that's not historically been our focus? Our focus has been clean it up, do the technical work, and then we got other stuff to clean up somewhere else. So how do you think we can play a useful role there?
And thank you for asking that. And it is happening in other program areas. I know, for instance, like Superfund is talking about this. Folks that are working with brownfields are having those conversations, because it's the same situation in those communities, that when the cleanup efforts come in and communities are engaged at some point about, what are you interested in having? Then again, there's all the other conversations about sort of managing your expectations, right? And nobody ever wants to hear that, because it always means that it's not going to be as good as you need it to be. Yeah. But what ultimately we want to make sure is the people that have suffered through, and maybe because they couldn't leave, they had no choice, and this is where they live and had no other place to go, that they get to benefit from all of what has been done and invested in that cleanup, to enjoy it and have that improved quality of life. But there's got to be a way that EPA does participate in this. It can't just be a sort of hit and run experience where the EPA is like, well, we did our job, now we have nothing to do with what is going on there. That's up to you all at the local level. That's not true. So EPA has to be part of that engagement to ensure that there's some way of securing community benefit and lasting, like the ability for them to have a lasting relationship with that space, right? And so that's got to be clearly a negotiation with the local government, but this is where EPA can use the weight of the federal government to say, look, we come in with this understanding, with these conversations and expectations from the community, and we need you, local government, to be a partner and party in that. And so there are actually sort of whole engagement guides that are being developed in some of the conversations, again, with Superfund folks. Again, I know this like through NEJAC, because it is very much a conversation that comes up, whether it's a matter of air quality, fence line monitoring, other kinds of soil or water contamination, or whatever it is, right? People want to able to stay in a place where they've got some kind of history or family, community, or whatever it is. And so it's frustrating again, though, when people don't have a say in that and other economic forces end up moving them out because the quality of housing and the cost of living change. And so they don't get to be the beneficiaries of the cleanup efforts.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Kyle, I'll stand down. I see lots of other hands.
No, this is great, Chris. And just to Sylvia's point, we specifically address this in the report. We talk about that really even just making GLRI applicants address this question of what could the impact of the project be on property values, really kind of pushing out of those traditional boundaries that grant applicants have been in, that as we go into the next decade of GLRI funding, we all have a responsibility to kind of take that 360 view. And we talk about that in the report. So Larry, I see your hand is up, so I'll turn it to you and have your interaction. Then John, when Larry and Chris have had their conversation, you can jump in after that.
Okay, great. Yeah, this kind of goes back to conversations that we had a couple questions back. But again, one of the things that we kind of glossed over in the report, not doing a lot of effort, is the whole idea of what's happening with our changing climate and the weather pattern changes, and the fact that traditional management practices had a different design storm and a different implementation strategy. You know, the fact that we're seeing a wetter winter and springs, the fact that we're seeing increasing frequency of higher intensity storm events, and the impact that has both on, all over the watershed, urban and rural, from urban flooding to wet fields and the lot. So in terms of future visioning, some thought in terms of how do we either manipulate or modify or readjust our traditional management approaches, our structural and non-structural management practices to address the issues that we're seeing because of the changing weather patterns. And then ultimately the impact that has on both legacy nutrient sources and also what we consider would be the excess of or the new nutrient sources.
So Larry, let me follow up with that. Does that mean, are you suggesting, for example, that NRCS should take the lead on, really looking at its current practices and updating them? I mean, is this a government-led project that you're suggesting? I mean, where would this begin? Who's the starting entity that would say, this needs to be done, I'm going to take the lead to start?
Well, yes, I think as we start looking at because of the changes that we're observing, there needs to be a larger focus, I think, on water management, on either trapping or reduction or, detention, retention, and those types of aspects. So rather than just addressing the nutrient management plan, I think we need to start thinking about how do we develop a water management plan? And looking at existing management solutions or practices that NRCS might have out, and how are they applicable to addressing that type of a situation.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, John. Thanks, Larry. Go ahead, John. And then Frank, we'll get to you after John. John, you're muted.
Thank you. I want to go back to Sylvia's comment real quick. On issues of gentrification and, what type of restoration are we going to do with some of these projects where there's a remediation and restoration opportunity following it? Clearly, restoration activities that are contemplated when you're also contemplating remediation and revitalization. Looking at it holistically is the cheapest way to achieve the maximum effort. So, and I think EPA has done a pretty good job of starting to think that way. but it gets back to the nuts and bolts of making sure the communities that are impacted are involved, notified, involved, informed, educated as to potential outcomes early on before those decisions are made. So we spent a lot of time talking about that community outreach and stakeholder involvement at those early points. And we have some pretty good recommendations in the report there. In talking about the second comment, about the climate change aspect of it, NOAA, USGS, NRCS, they're all kind of involved and can be working together. But just like the NPDS program, it's not just quality, it's quantity. You know, your discharge has a lot to do with what you're allowed to do. The volume and the quality go hand in hand. So having a better understanding of quantities and resiliency of what you're building now for potential lake levels that could happen in the future, that sort of thing, is really, really important. And I think we've touched on that in the reports. So thanks.
Thank you, John.
Go ahead, Frank.
Yes, I wanted to build off what Larry was saying, and that's about the climate. I agree with all of the issues that you were raising, Larry, but I also think that one of the pressures that we're going to be under in the Great Lakes, dealing with all of our issues, is climate migration. We have increasing population from areas that are increasingly uninhabitable. Some of the coastal areas down south and in other areas. I bring this example up that I understand that there's a significant population from Puerto Rico that has moved to Buffalo, New York, just because of the issues with all of the storms, for instance, the hurricanes. And so these issues are going to put additional, not just dealing with our existing infrastructure and existing problems, but they're going to cause more load on our existing systems and consequently more problems because of this increased population. And we also have not only people, but we're going to have businesses moving in because of the availability of water. And there are areas that were in the Southwest, we're in this several decades long drought that looks like it's going to go on for maybe another 10 years or so at least. And so I think that we need to be prepared in the Great Lakes to deal not only with the existing issues and how we can make them more equitable and fair, but we also have to deal with this increased pressure of both residential and also industrial pressure that we're going to have on the lakes. So we have to keep all that in mind. Thank you.
Frank, I couldn't agree more. It's coming. I couldn't agree more.
Thank you, Frank. All right, so we'll do Laura, Brian, and then Sylvia. I do just want to make a note of the time. At 2:15, we want to go through the process of the vote. So go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, so my comments are building off of Sylvia and John, but I think it's also getting to your question, Chris, of the elevator speech of what's working and what doesn't. I think GLRI has been very successful at a lot of the ecosystem restoration, and you can point to the VUI, the toxic chemicals removed, and the habitat. I think, though, along the way, we have an opportunity where we have found some of the sometimes intended or unintended consequences. So when we talk about gentrification, when we talk about lack of public access, when we talk about lack of local workforce development, and I think a lot of what we're hoping is that the recommendations in this report help us refine some of the metrics that GLRI has, some of the RFP scoring, some of the outcomes that GLRI has, to broaden that a bit beyond just these, how many species, how many miles, to really thinking about where can we also build local workforce and improve the tax base? Where can we also ensure that there's greater public access for all people? Where can we make sure that as we're developing, we're leveraging or rewarding affordable housing programs or projects with HUD in there. And so I would say I think there's been some great progress, and I think as we learn, we can continue to refine what we reward and what we're measuring as outcomes.
As always, thank you, Laura. Very, very helpful. Hey, Brian, looks like you're up.
Yes. Okay. Chris, going back to your original question, and from a nutrient management perspective, I don't think of it so much in terms of what you've done right or what you've done wrong. I think of it more in terms of evolution of GLRI and what's needed moving forward. And in the early days, we rightfully focused on where are the places that are bad that we need to fix and mitigate. But as we move forward and we make progress and we've restored a lot of those places, we have to think about how do we take the good places and keep them from getting worse, because that's far cheaper to prevent an area from changing land uses that now start to result in much greater nutrient outputs. And so things like land use planning, watershed planning, activities that communities can take to make sure they don't get worse and don't exceed nutrient reductions is something that we probably want to focus on, because it's cheaper to do that now than wait till they're impacted.
Thank you. And totally agree. Totally agree.
So thanks, everyone. These are great comments. I think, Steve, why don't we, looking at the agenda, and again, Kurt, just confirming that we don't have any public comments. Just looking at the agenda, if we go now for the vote, then we can go back to discussion. I just don't want to wait till, 5 minutes before the meeting ends for the vote. So Steve, how does that work for you?
Yes, that sounds real good. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So I sent everyone the great guidance from EPA, which was super helpful around how we actually move this forward. But if we could have a vote, that would be great. So I would ask for a motion to adopt this draft of the Great Lakes Advisory Board report and finalize that and forward it to EPA.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, we have a first from Alan and a second from Lisa. Is there any discussion before we take a vote? I'm looking. Okay, then we have a motion on the floor. Can you either voice or put your hand up? All in favor of that?
Aye.
Aye.
Excellent. Anyone opposed to the motion?
Aye.
Is that okay? I think we have no opposition. There you go, EPA. Bam, there's your consensus. And we do need to do a round of applause. This has been a huge amount of work from the Great Lakes Advisory Board members, particularly our members that joined late and were thrown a ton of work to do. The flexibility of the group, the conversation around environmental justice. It's just been really heartening. And we did this all virtually. So I know, Steve, you probably want to say something as well. So I'll turn it to you, but I cannot express my appreciation enough to the members and for all of your intelligence and great ideas. I say, Chris, I'll just say to you, this is it right here on this Zoom. There's the dedication to the Great Lakes from every member of the GLAB is rock solid. So Steve, I'll turn it to you.
What have you left me to say, Kyle? My sincere thanks to all of you. And I have to underscore again, there are some really big thinkers here. And it's been a genuine joy for me to be able to work with you all and quite frankly, learn from you all. So thank you. And Chris, I know you were representing a lot of your folks with your questions. And I guess I want to just say thank you for your engagement. And I think we do have some time to continue the conversation. Thanks. Back to you, Kyle.
Yeah, I would just throw it out now for any members of the GLAB that want to respond to Chris. The level of engagement, Chris, that you've just shown us this afternoon and throughout the process is really, really heartening and really helpful and much appreciated. So any GLAB members you want to jump in, and also Lisa did this shout out to Chris, who pulled us from the brink and helped to write this document. So a big appreciation to Chris and to Curd. But any members of the GLAB want to jump in? Okay, Chris, you have your hand up.
Two things. So first, I want to make clear to everyone who's listening that the Chris that that Kyle is commending is Chris Roosh, because it gets confusing with a bunch of Chris's around. So I just want to echo that. That's certainly not me that did all that. But then mostly, I just wanted to say, just take a moment now that we have a final report that's been endorsed by the GLAB. Thank you so much. And I mean that because, as I said at the very beginning, on your own time, on your own dime, very difficult questions. None of this is easy. If it was easy, we wouldn't need a GLAB. So I'm happy to continue this vibrant discussion, but please accept on behalf of EPA, Administrator Regan, and the administration, and certainly on behalf of myself, again, heartfelt thanks for a tremendous amount of work, which we will read and vet very carefully. I certainly can't promise that every recommendation will be adopted or implemented, but just for today, thank you. So Kyle, I'll pause there and dive back into the discussion whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Chris. Go ahead, Sylvia.
Sorry, trouble with the buttons. Thanks very much for that, Chris. I think one of the things that would be helpful, and we talked to Lindsay some about this, was really trying to get a clearer understanding, especially for GRLI, about what recommendations connect to which offices or leadership. Pardon me, because it wasn't clear to us where we were even searching for information to understand the metrics that you all receive or drawing from. So it would help for like how it is that you even look at where the evaluation is for the next action plan or the current action plan, and how they can connect with recommendations that we make. Because I think that that's part of where we were at a loss for understanding who to go to or where to find information. And in what forms it's sort of aggregated. We saw like the congressional reports, but we were imagining there's got to be something shorter or more accessible than those, in order to understand really how you all are making the determinations about success and reaching, metrics.
So, Todd, all right, I could jump in on that, but Todd, I'm going to just say a line or two and turn it over to you. But so if I understand your question, we are largely self-sufficient in developing the action plan and the metrics within GLNPO with the help of all our federal partners that also participate in the GLRI. We don't do it by ourselves. We certainly take the lead as the lead agency, but we do some amount of reaching out to other divisions or programs within EPA, Water Division, Office of Water, but it's largely based, the last action plan was largely based on where we had come based on the previous action plan before that. Where had we fallen really short? Did we think the priorities in the earlier action plan still reflected where we are today? And should those priorities continue? Or do we think, actually we took a pretty big bite out of that apple, we're going to move other things into the priority? But it's pretty much, the leadership on that does pretty much come from GLNPO and the National Program Manager within Region 5. So I think in putting that together, that largely does come, at least initially, the initial suggestions on what metrics we would develop, how we would measure those, et cetera. Those come largely from within GLNPO. And then once we have a rough idea, we share that with our regional working group partners. And then as we get further down the action plan development process, Last time we did this, we took it on the road, so to speak. We went out and did a number of road stops where we met with the public and engaged with the community and explained to people what we were thinking, and we wanted to hear what they thought about that. And we had extensive engagement with the tribes on the action plan before we put it together. So if your question is, who really is putting this together and who should be reading these recommendations, it is primarily us, because we do have primary responsibility for doing the metrics and writing the plan, et cetera. So first, let me pause. Am I getting at your question?
In part, yes. I think as you're describing there, it would be helpful to know then, like if we have a question on how is it that you're determining success of the types of outreach you're doing, and then what is the scope of that outreach? So if we just wanted to get a summary of what it is that you've done, where, how many times, who was engaged, when we were trying to, again, because we went off in part anecdotal information, right? Because we couldn't get data, quantitative or even any kind of qualitative summary data. And so when we were trying to seek such, even Lindsay struggled to figure out how we can get connected with who, and it was a struggle to figure out where we get that information, right? And so I think just in terms of the next steps, in terms of where it is that the GLAB can be most helpful, if you can also maybe help point us to where it is to access information that's short of what a full congressional report or some other public facing document is.
And are you looking for information specifically on our public outreach activities, like data on that particular aspect of the program?
Yes, and also communities that are engaged, like with the AOCs and adjacent communities and such.
Okay, so
when we're talking, like, for instance, in the context of the conversations we've had around environmental justice and who's participating and which communities are not being engaged.
So the short answer is, historically, we have not kept like formal records or lists of every time we've gone out and met with, gone to a community and done a presentation on the GLRI. To do that, we would have to rely on the memories and old emails and old filings, because it was not something that we focused on, tracking every outreach activity that we did. We just built that into whatever the project was in front of us. So for example, when we were drafting and getting ready to issue a new action plan, we knew outreach and engagement was important, so we did it. But we did not keep, I couldn't go to a sheet and go, oh yes, here's the clear spreadsheet of every place we went, when we went there, who was there. We haven't kept those kinds of records, except to whatever extent they may lie in the personal notes and personal recollections of individuals who were involved. I think going forward, because of this administration's emphasis on outreach, we are going to do a better job of tracking that activity. But I'm not going to, sit here and tell you, oh yes, we've got perfect records of everything we've done, because that was not a focus. We were focused much more on getting the work done and figuring out what the work was than keeping track of who we talked to about it. So I don't think there is that kind of very readily identifiable information that you're looking for. So
Chris,
Todd,
I appreciate that. Thank you.
let me turn to Todd. Todd, would you concur with that? Am I missing something?
I think you've hit it, Chris. And the way I look at it is, it's an issue of scale. You have things that are done GLRI wide. You have things that are perhaps done on an issue or on a geographic, sub part of the Great Lakes, and at that project level. And it's really hard to have some, comprehensive list, as Chris indicated, of all those different things. So maybe going forward, it's trying to take lessons learned. Here was a particularly good means of engagement at one of those different scales that could, be either translated or redone or improved going forward.
So I appreciate it. Maybe just one last thing I'll add is that I think that there are good models out there for community engagement and documentation, at least at a high level of just summarizing. We participated in X number of meetings and Y number of communities, to at least try to get a sense too of the distribution of the points of contact. And again, when we're talking about equitable distribution of resources, right? And making sure that we're not just, again, prioritizing people who have access and knowledge and know-how, but that other spaces and communities are meaningfully being engaged and incorporated in some way, even if it's going to take more time or more levels of participation to get people to a space where they can participate in a more meaningful way through the GRLA programs. But I think the concerns are, again, trying to figure out how we're with more intentionality meeting what this administration is calling for. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Laura, and then Scudder, I see you. Go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, thanks, because it is on this thread. I think from my point of view, it's similar to Sylvia, but it's not as down in the weeds about how many times you went out and met with a certain public. I think we struggled a little bit with one of our charge questions was sort of how well is GLNPO reaching the public, informing the public of the work. And I think one of the things we struggled with is we didn't even know what your goals were on informing the public or how you were measuring that. And so not down in like how many meetings you had or whatever, but sort of what did you set out to do with your information and education campaign? What were your metrics? And we just didn't feel like we had that kind of information or that kind of context. And so it was a little bit more what we each knew and what we had heard about, your information scheme. So that would be the only thing I would say that would have been helpful, is either to have talked to a staff member about that or had a little bit more understanding of what your plan initially was.
And one thing that I'll say, and this probably comes as no surprise, maybe it does come as a surprise. I'm not sure in addressing both Laura and Sylvia's comments. Historically in the 10 or so years that I've been in GLNPO, our focus has been getting environmental restoration and protection work done. And that's what it's been. And, in light of the new administration's focus on outreach and EJ, it's never been brought to the forefront like it has under this administration. This is a very different template for us to operate under. So to be frank, given our relatively limited resources, at least in terms of personnel and staffing and so forth, our focus, as I think people like Steve and so forth can vouch for, has been, we want to get the work done that we know needs to be done. We want to get the sediments cleaned up. We want to get the habitat restored. We want to keep the carp out of Lake Michigan. We want to do whatever that is. But gauging and measuring and developing metrics for outreach was not something that rose to that same level of priority. And what I'm hearing, and I'm just being very candid, and again, I don't think that's a surprise to anybody, but what I'm hearing here, certainly from Laura and from Sylvia, and certainly what we're hearing from our own senior administration is, yeah, rethink that, just to cut to the chase. So, but I can't sit here and say that, yes, we devoted a lot of resources to tracking that information, because we did not.
And we appreciate that, Chris, and we talk about that in the report. And so I'll just jump in. I mean, for Laura, Sylvia, for the whole GLAB, we'd be happy to talk about that more, because that's kind of the next phase, right? That's where things need to head. And as Laura pointed out, Sylvia pointed out, there's a lot of good models that the agency could jump from, for sure. So we're at the half hour. Scudder, I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, the question I had, well, where to next from here, but I think we're at the end of our time. And the last thing I would say that, Chris, you make excellent virtual donuts. And I think that's the reason that we got the report done and passed. So thank you, and Steve, for your leadership as the co-chairs. It is somewhat like herding cats and maybe some other things as well, salamanders, I don't know. But really appreciate, all of the guidance and support. And then, of course, for Chris Rush, who I think did an absolutely fabulous job in pulling together all sorts of different writing styles and coming out with a reasonably coherent report. Just kudos to her and that team. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Scudder. And Steve, do you want to say anything? Okay. So Chris, I think it would be helpful if we just conclude with you, if you could just give the GLAB members kind of an idea of the future related to this topic.
Sure. So what happens now is this particular term of the GLAB is winding down. And it wound down, I think, with great fanfare and a very good report with a lot of interesting, carefully crafted, certainly carefully thought out recommendations. And now it's our job to look at those very closely and determine to what extent we should, can, will implement those recommendations into the GLRI going forward. That's what happens next. Now, we want to keep the GLAB around. We are in the process of setting up the GLAB for the next 2-year term, which will start pretty quickly. And I don't want to say a whole lot more about that because some of that is pending, but I will tell those who are listening in from the public, the GLAB is not going away. There will continue to be a Great Lakes Advisory Board. And I expect the next step will, while we're looking at this report, we will also be thinking about charge questions for an upcoming report because, I think even this report will probably generate charge questions we wouldn't have thought of 2 years ago that we're going to be looking for advice on. So Kyle, I think in a nutshell, this is one chapter of the GLAB. It's not closing, but this particular piece of work and these charge questions have been addressed, and this chapter is winding down, which will lead the way to a new chapter. And again, we've got a lot of work to do in evaluating and looking at this very nice piece of work that you've just presented to us and have endorsed as a full GLAB.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. So we will conclude the GLAB unless anyone has anything else.
I just want to provide a verbal thank you to Lindsay for all her hard work here. Just want to make sure. I know there's been a lot of thanks in the chats, but just wanted to bring it out front.
This is Frank, and I just want to comment on Scudder's comment. I personally would much rather be a salamander than a cat. So.
Yes, agree with that, Frank, and very much appreciation to Lindsay. She got us through from start to finish. Amazing leadership. All right, everyone. Best of luck with all that you do. Thanks so much. It's been great getting to know everyone. So thanks for your work. Later.